This is our business. It's where commitment is born. A personal stake in everything we do. Innovation and technical expertise at our core. Responsibility deeply felt. We are relentless, curious, trailblazing, transforming with purpose, helping communities connect, and people thrive, globally, locally, with energy, water, and urbanization made sustainable for generations to come. Because your community is our community. Your challenge is our challenge. And your world is our world. GHD, the power of commitment.
Welcome back, everyone. What a fantastic start to our next session. So our next session today is the future of local government post water reform, and it's going to be a really lively session. I've got the real privilege now of introducing David Norman, who's going to kick our session off. He's an executive advisor for economics and strategy at GHD, silver sponsor and sponsor for this session. David, as I said, he's an executive advisor in economics and strategy with GHD. Prior to that, he was chief economist at Auckland Council, providing advice to elected members and senior staff at Auckland Council. Most of David's economic career has been in the private sector. He's worked at the Business and Economic Research Limited with PwC and Westpac, and he also worked with the Building Research Association, or BRANZ. So he has some real insights into the challenges faced by the construction and infrastructure sector. He's also building his third family home, so he definitely understands very well the supply chain issues that the market is facing at the moment as well. Also, I have to say that prior to embarking on an economic career, David worked in Taiwan and China. He's got a postgraduate diploma in business administration, a BA in economics and Mandarin. He's also got a BSc in psychology and genetics. So I might be speaking to you after this for all sorts of help. David, welcome to Building Nations, and I'm very pleased to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rory, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining our session. It's my privilege to be able to talk to you today on this really key topic, the future of local government post-water reform. As you've heard, I'm at GHD now, but also have 4.5 years experience working right there in the thick of things in local government. So I understand a lot of the challenges that local government faces in terms of infrastructure and everything else. So that provides some of the backdrop for what I'm going to talk about this morning. So firstly, my disclaimer, if you like. It's important to see the views that I give here as my own. They're my professional view. They are data-driven, as hopefully you'll see, but they aren't necessarily always the same views as all of my colleagues at GHD. So please don't leave this session thinking, oh, everyone at GHD must have this particular view. Although hopefully you will agree that my views are data-driven and do make sense. So what I want to cover today, I've only got a short amount of time, but really just three things. Firstly, an infrastructure scene setter. Just before the session started, talking to some of our elected members who will be sharing with you in a moment, it was very clear that they're all facing similar issues in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure shortfall. You've no doubt heard a lot about that already at this conference. It is an infrastructure conference, but I'll touch on that briefly. Then we'll talk about water reform and some of the questions I think that still need to be answered over these next couple of years that are fundamental to how well this succeeds or otherwise. And then thirdly, local government beyond water, and that's sort of the lead into the discussion with elected members. So the scene setter, none of you need me to tell you that we have an infrastructure shortfall, and you can probably struggle to to think of a part of the economy where we have sufficient investment in infrastructure, whether it's transport or water, healthcare, freight, whatever else. And we're also in the midst of an unprecedented level of investment in both residential and infrastructure assets at local government level, at central government level. And you see the record building consents in Auckland, for example, 20,000 new dwellings consented in the last year. But we're not the only ones. In fact, if you look at the work that the G20 recently did on planned investment in infrastructure around the world, and this is just looking at 56 nations, presumably mostly the wealthier or bigger economies, 94 trillion New Zealand dollars expected to be spent over the next 20 years on infrastructure. That's 300 times New Zealand's annual GDP, or 15 times our GDP per year being spent on infrastructure around the world. And the G20 concludes that that's probably a shortfall of about 18 trillion compared to what it should be. So add another 55 times New Zealand's GDP to that figure. So if you look at the picture there on the right of the screen, that's where the money is supposed to be going. Now we might look at that and say, well, that looks a bit odd. Is it too little for water? What types of energy are they spending on? Is it all fossil fuels? That's a lot for roads. Should they be looking at other options? And we can debate that, but there's the reality that everyone is trying to infrastructure their way out of COVID weakness, and also to overcome what's been an infrastructure shortfall in many countries over many years. So what does this mean? Well, we're competing with everyone else around the world for skills and for access to the right equipment and materials to deliver the infrastructure we need. So we know already we had a skills shortage before COVID hit in terms of construction, both vertical and horizontal. Now, of course, we have our borders largely closed, and we've had a raft of new central government infrastructure announcements. So we had NZ Upgrade, $12 billion announced before COVID even hit. That feels like a lifetime ago. Then we had the shovel-ready projects, over $3 billion in the May 20 budget. We have Crown Infrastructure Partners repurposing of the old fibre rollout business to stimulate delivery of local infrastructure. And then we have more recently the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. And there will be others, but those are just some of the chunks of money that are being thrown at infrastructure at the moment. If you look at the picture there, the graph I've put up, this just tracks growth in employment in construction over the last 10 years compared to building work consented in the blue, and in the pink, building work actually put in place in real terms. And what you see here is we have actually grown our construction employment by over 50%, around 60, 65% over the last 10 years. And we've put even more than that in place in terms of building work, which implies an increase in productivity in the sector, which is great. It's one of the sectors people always seem to knock for weak productivity growth. But you can see that we are falling further and further behind in terms of what we want to build versus what we're actually delivering. And now, of course, water reform. So the figures, that we've all heard spoken about, 120 to 185 billion dollars to be spent over the next 30 years. That's just more work that's going to need to be done. So who's going to do this work? That's the question we need to ask here. And so that leads us to the third challenge, I think, around infrastructure and this insatiable demand. How do we get value in terms of what infrastructure we deliver and what we prioritize? Whenever you have something in short supply, basic economics, prices go up. And so whether this is residential construction, I'm experiencing that myself, and the increase in costs to build, but we're seeing it in infrastructure across the country and across the world as well. Prices are surging. Interest rates are going up again. So again, it's going to make it more expensive to borrow. How do we make sure we get value for infrastructure projects? And this is a big part of my work. I always say, if you remember me as nothing else, think of me as the trade-offs guy. I'm the guy who asks questions about what is the value that we're getting out of this for people's lives compared to the cost of the infrastructure that we're putting in. And so the final question on this is, how are we going to pay for all this? So development contributions, we know these need to be reviewed. I'm encouraged to see some councils, Auckland and Hamilton, for example, really looking at DCs seriously and pushing those up. I see other councils reluctant to increase development contributions to reflect the true cost of growth infrastructure. If you're in a position of relatively unconstrained debt, that might seem like an easy option now, but it can come back to bite you in another 10 years. So these are the challenges. Do we need more targeted rates? Are we going to have to see higher central government taxes, higher water bills? The last one almost certainly to pay for the infrastructure that we're talking about delivering. So we've got this perfect storm of strong existing shortfall of infrastructure. We've got a skills shortage. We've got consequentially rising prices. We've got materials disruption and insatiable global competition. And so these are the challenges that we face. So let's talk about water reform then more generally before I move into where this leaves local government. So the water reform, we've been hearing about it for a while. Some decisions have been made, but I think there's still a bunch of questions that need to be answered that haven't been completely answered. And that's not meant as a criticism. I think this is just something we need to work through over the next couple of years, but we really must have answers for these questions if we're going to have the outcome that we want. And again, these are the sorts of questions that an economist asks. Immediately when I see a policy or an infrastructure decision being made or being proposed, I say, how's this going to make people better off? A lot of people misunderstand economics as being finance, and it's all about dollars and cents. But of course, that's not what it is. Economics says, how do we use our limited resources, whether that's clean air or water or wind for energy or housing supply or money or time, labor, to maximize societal well-being, or utility is our nerdy word for it. And so when I see water reform, I ask the same questions. And I think we all need to, how is regulation in the first instance, if you think of water reform as regulation and amalgamation, how is regulation going to make people's lives better? So we've already got the water quality regulator being stood up, but there's still work to be done on the commercial and economic regulator. And I guess questions for me include, how are we going to balance water quality requirements versus commercial and economic sensibilities? So not every project we can do that might improve water quality, for example, is a good project to do. You have to look at the value that you're getting out of that versus the cost. Not only financial, but in terms of other environmental impacts of different changes we might make, for example. So how are we going to balance these? And who gets to make the final call on what we prioritize? The second part of the reform is the amalgamation component. And again, I ask the same questions. How will amalgamation make people's lives better? How will we decide which of the projects in this big basket of needs gets prioritized? And how will we demonstrate that the projects that we deliver are justified in terms of the value they deliver versus the cost? Projects shouldn't be done to meet targets. They should be done to achieve outcomes, and the right outcomes that actually improve people's quality of life. So that's a key question that we're going to have to consider. We need to remember that this money is not going to come from nowhere. The 120 to 185 billion is going to be paid for by the same people who pay other taxes and things at the moment. It's going to be paid by your water users, your ratepayers, your taxpayers. So how do we make sure that these people are getting value? Now, thinking as we move towards the end of my presentation about implications for council, I think there's one implication to think about directly related to water reform still, and that is councils are going to be in a position where a bunch of debt gets removed from their balance sheets, but also in most cases a line item perhaps from their rates bill for X $100 a year paying for water. Are we going to be in a situation where councils say, okay, well, people in our area, we're paying $300 a year for water, so we're going to delete that line item. We're going to give them their $300 back because now they're going to be paying a water utility, that $300, or maybe more, maybe less. Or are they going to say, well, we're going to give back slightly less than that $300? Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But again, councils are going to have to think through very carefully what sorts of projects could be funded by an effective increase in the total rates plus water bill. Not every project is a good one. How are they going to prioritize some of the other infrastructure that perhaps has been underinvested in or is desperately in need of renewal to use that extra funding if they choose to effectively increase the total rates and water bill total that people are paying? And then I guess one of the other concerns for me, because I see it with some councils already, is will the suddenly improved financial position, if they've gotten rid of a bunch of debt and they free up debt capacity, will this disincentivize councils from actually making some of the tougher decisions that they need to? For example, increasing development contributions to reflect the true economic cost of new development. I've seen some councils right up against that debt cap, and they're working hard to make sure that costs align with the true costs and prices align with the true cost of delivering infrastructure. Other councils far more laissez-faire because they don't feel that same pressure. Now, if they have even less debt pressure, it may disincentivize them from making those important economic decisions. So the question, I guess, from this slide is, will the water user, the ratepayer and the taxpayer be better off financially? Maybe not. That's not the be all and end all. As I say, economics isn't really just about dollars in your pocket. Will they be better? Will they have a better mix of services but be paying more or the same? Okay, that might be a good outcome if we're giving them a better mix of goods and services. Or will they have neither lower bills and all better outcomes? That, of course, would not be a good option. So where does this leave us? Thinking of water reform now being worked through, water being taken off local governments. Well, it's not the only reform on the plate, is it? We're looking at RMA reform. We recently, or a while back now, had the National Policy Statement on Urban Development introduced, but very recently in the last few weeks had a bipartisan agreement to accelerate that and effectively override some local government zoning rules. And so again, that's sort of taking some more power away from local government, I guess, rightly or wrongly. Local government review is underway. There's talk of transport reform. And if we see all these different reforms beginning to have to chip away at the role of local government, what does this mean for the role of local government? And perhaps provocatively, I'm ending with this question. Does this mean the role of local government is parks, libraries and pools? What is the role that they should be playing? Of course, the local government review will come out with some views on that. But I think what we really want to hear today is from our elected members where they see the role of local government going from here. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to David Wilson, who will be facilitating the panel, and he will introduce our esteemed elected members. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, David Norman. Morena, everybody. My name's David Wilson. I'm facilitating this esteemed group of elected officials and commissioner in this next panel session. What I heard from David Norman just then kind of frames some of what we're asking our panelists to respond to today, and that is questions around regulation, around amalgamation, will the taxpayers be better off, and what kinds of functions do you think local government will be looking forward to as a result of what Susan Freeman-Green said this morning, or coined this morning, as the juggernaut of reforms coming towards local government. And let me just reiterate some of those: planning, RMA, three waters, health, the future of local government itself, and I would add economic development and education. And even though those things are somewhat at the fringe of what we're talking about today. So let me quickly introduce you to our panel, and I will introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. They'll each have 5 minutes to answer two extremely difficult questions. So first up, the Honourable Anne Tolley. She is the Commissioner for the Tauranga City Council. Second is Sam Broughton, Mayor, Selwyn District Council from the South Island, for all you North Islanders that don't know where Selwyn is. Third, Neil Holdom, Mayor of the New Plymouth District Council, and as he calls himself, the accidental mayor. Fourth up, Paula Southgate, the Mayor for Hamilton City Council, and running up in number 5th, Dr. Roger Blakeley, Councillor for the Greater Wellington Regional Council. Welcome to all our panellists. So the questions I've got for these panellists to answer today follow on from some of the themes that David was talking about and the themes that Susan Freeman Green was talking about reimagining local democracy. What can central government let go of perhaps in the future of local government, and who does what and why? So the questions are these. Given what we've heard this morning, what do you believe would be the optimal arrangements for water reform, number one? And number two, if Three Waters are removed as a key function of local government, what does this mean for the future of local government? So first up, I'll hand over to the Honourable Anne Tolley, Commissioner for Tauranga City Council, and I will try and keep these people on time because we do want to have a bit of Q&A. Welcome, Anne.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Look, in answer to your first question, I think it's obvious that there's a huge amount of community antipathy, and it's absolutely crucial that through those next steps that we deal with that and get good information out to communities. I would really hope that the government doesn't leave it to local government to explain their reforms and takes a more active part in working with our communities. The three issues that I'm particularly concerned about, of course, is the governance and how we recognise and respect the ownership of those assets that many people over generations have paid to develop in their communities. Secondly, stormwater, and it was good to hear the Minister mention that this morning. There's much more to be talked about with stormwater. Here in Tauranga, we, partly because of our topology, I think we use it as a resource. We use it to create wetlands, parklands, areas of recreation. They're not just all about pipes. So you know, I think there's a lot more water to go under the bridge, pardon the pun. And then thirdly, as an area where there is just relentless growth, and David Norman referred to some of those difficult decisions that are going to have to be made, that relationship with those high growth councils is going to be absolutely critical. We're already dealing with a government agency, Waka Kotahi, who are difficult to get to the table, difficult to keep to their commitments, and have a huge impact on housing development. So water as a major part of urban development, we need timeliness of decisions, we need funding commitments, and we need the delivery of services, again, in a timely fashion. So going on to the second question, it's clear that Three Waters are still going to be important parts for local government for the next couple of years, and it's critical that we continue to invest in those and not sort of take a hands off and think, oh well, it's all going to be part of a new entity and they can take care of it. And David Norman referred to the fact that the removal of debt then gives headroom to a number of councils, and Tauranga City is one of those. It's had great investments in fairness in its Three Waters over in the past, but the rest of the community amenities have been left because of this idea that you've got to keep rates low, so you build up your debt to invest in the important things, and you leave your community facilities behind. And we've had to come in as a commission and try and redress that through things like who's paying for what. Development contributions are an enormous part of that. And there's a huge amount of community angst that growth isn't paying for growth. There's no doubt that infrastructure makes communities work, and it does need scale. But actually, community amenities build communities, and they need to be local. And when I talk about community amenities, I'm talking not the four well-beings, and to David Norman, well, parks, libraries and pools are an important part of any community, because they're the families of the people that work need to have recreation. They spend more time out of work in their community than they spend in their jobs. But you also have the role for council of making sure that there's enough land for development and that it's done, good urban design. You've got sustainability, biodiversity, climate change. How do we create our city centres, and that can only be done locally. And city centres are important because they bind and link our communities together. So I see my time's just about up, but those are the issues. I think there's a huge role still for local government without those three waters sitting on their balance sheet. Thank you for the opportunity. Kia ora.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you also for your succinct answer, and obviously you're well practiced at doing that. Let's move on to Sam. Welcome, Sam, from Selwyn District, and we're looking forward to hearing your views.
Tēnā koutou, Rory and David, thank you for your presentation this morning. Tēnā koutou to the other panellists and all those watching online and interacting with these really important issues that are facing our country. I think that the key part at the moment is thinking about the context of change. We can focus in on water and we can narrow in on one piece of reform that's going on, but I think we can't get away from the fact that COVID is having a massive impact on our country at the moment. And so the types of discussions that we have and the tone of those discussions has changed dramatically. I think the last time there was such national interest in a single discussion might have been when the Rugby World Cup was here. And it's just that you could talk to anyone on the street and everyone would have an opinion on either how the All Blacks were doing or how the game in their local town was. But a lot of those conversations were about bringing people together. I think the difficult part is over the last 12, 24 months, a lot of the conversations in New Zealand have been things that have divided us. And when we think about the way that COVID has rolled out and now the conversations around vaccinations, there's been a lot of things where there's been a divisiveness rather than a coming together. And the Three Waters conversation has certainly continued that vein of separating people, separating communities, allowing divisiveness to enter local government New Zealand and for councils to be drawn into arguments against others, mayors the same, and then this disconnect between central government and local government, where local government felt that they were entering into an agreement that was an optional space, and now we've been told that it's mandatory. So I guess the environment of the conversation makes a lot of these questions far more heated. As far as what I believe are optimal arrangements, I want to see a change that embeds constant adaptation in it. We shouldn't have to wait, decades for change to occur or for a government to make massive decisions to get the best outcomes for our communities. And so setting up models that enable adaptation within them, I think, is really important. I also believe that if we have an end goal in mind, then actually getting and improving in direction is far more important than a time frame. And the hard conversation can actually be setting things, but I think the pace of change is very difficult. And at the moment, we've talked about the number of other reforms that are going on. To enable local governments to meet all those reform agendas, we need far more time because there's not capacity in the system to respond to each, and they're all very important things for our country to adapt to. So setting really firm end goals and a direction, so important, but the timing needs to be looked at. I think we want to also think about how we all become better off in this. And there's been a fair bit of discussion around who's paying for who else's stuff. Actually, the context of this change is around everyone being better off over the medium to long term. And I think about the changes we've made in Selwyn about 6 years ago. We're fully metered. We charge all our drinking water by metre. We've got a multi-barrier approach to all our drinking water supplies. All of our wastewater is treated and disposed to land and is fully consented. And we've been able to do that and take that approach by districtising our charging. And so Rolleston, Te Wharikakaho, the town, 20,000 people, really helps subsidise Arthur's Pass, a town of 100 people. And so those types of ways of working have certainly happened in a local space. Convincing a local community to support another one an hour up the road is different than trying to think about how we do that across 5 hours down the road. And so the size of the entities has certainly entered into the conversation that we've got now. And I think without having the drinking water regulator in place and enforcing those regulations, it's meant that people have felt like they haven't had a chance to think about what other alternatives could be arrived at locally. I think a really important piece for Selwyn too, we've been so fast in growth in the last 10 years, is around making sure that the spatial planning work that we're doing for Greater Christchurch in partnership with our neighbours directs where water services are connected, and that we don't see water services entities hold up growth where councils and spatial planning, particularly regional or sub-regional spatial planning, has directed that growth and intensification will go. The 1998 Ngāi Tahu Settlement Act talks about a Ngāi Tahu holding rangatiratanga across their takiwa, and the government apology in that act says that they will work in a new age of cooperation with Ngāi Tahu, and also mentions that they hold and confirms the rangatira Tauranga status across the takiwā. I haven't seen a new age of cooperation since 1998 between the government and Ngāi Tahu, although this water reform and the infrastructure within that starts to talk about a new way of doing things. So I can see the government now trying to actually live up to the promises that it made, 23 years ago through that settlement with Ngāi Tahu. I think as far as the future for local government goes, it's looking really strong. New Zealand communities are based on a connection to one another, a desire to have self-direction, and holding on to a national pride and contribution to the greater good. And I don't think that removing water infrastructure from local councils is going to change that. I think the scope for local government involvement needs to include health, education, welfare, housing, and many other things that government currently does. And I look forward to that wider conversation. Thank you for the reminder that 5 minutes is up. But I believe that, FFLG is the way to go. Let's change things up. Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you for your really responsive lead into the next speaker. So I'd like to welcome Neil Holdom, the not accidental mayor for New Plymouth, to give us his contribution. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Look, I think in terms of an ideal model, flexibility in terms of the governance model, I think if there are more than one model that can achieve the government's bottom line, we shouldn't necessarily apply a one-size-fits-all. I mean, Auckland is different. Different regions have different cultures, and could we improve the model to accommodate those? I think another critical element is that whatever the reforms, where they land, they need to be efficient and understandable. The two regulators are the primary compliance tools, and we just have to understand, and the earlier speaker talked about cost benefit. As we add layers of additional compliance, we're increasing costs, but there'll be diminishing returns. And then, look, I think there's some technical stuff about the underlying entity architecture that needs to be consistent. Common enterprise resource planning equipment, data architecture, and a commitment to standardisation of design and technical standards across New Zealand will lower costs over the long term. I think really for these things to be successful, they need to be apolitical. The political uncertainty is undermining the morale of our Three Waters workforce. The big question for people opposing reform is, have you got something better? And the question I often ask people is, would you fly your family in an aircraft managed, maintained, and piloted by a group of politicians? I don't think our political system is geared to deliver asset management maturity. Ideally, when it comes to our core water, energy, roading, health, education, infrastructure, the politicians need to get their heads together and determine what is the service levels New Zealanders want, and then gear up organisations to fund them appropriately, and save the kind of political debates for stuff around the margins, because this cyclical nature of ups and downs, and it doesn't work with good asset management planning. In terms of the future, I think neither central government nor local government has demonstrated the high levels of asset management maturity that we see overseas or in the private sector. The reality is, if government wanted to be consistent, it would actually apply the Three Waters philosophy to Waka Kotahi, split off the regulators' functions, create a new asset management and service delivery entity, open up the balance sheet and actually get on and do the work. In terms of where local government is going, local government will have to adapt or perish. I think it's pretty clear David Parker's blueprint for the next 10 years appears to be 14 regional unitary authorities, some form of co-governance with tangata whenua. If councils can get their act together, partner up with tangata whenua now and focus on what's important to the people in the regions they serve, they might get ahead of the government's reform machine and actually start adapting, pitch a new compelling story about how they can undertake this work currently administered pretty poorly by central government, more efficiently at a regional level, e.g., housing, transport, climate response, placemaking, economic navigation. I think the government clearly holds the key. If DPMC and Treasury are not prepared to divest some of their portfolios and the corresponding funding to new council entities, what we can expect is a Royal Commission coming in to design some architecture, a massively centralised model that realistically I don't think will serve local democracy well. I think the idea of New Zealand being run by completely by risk-averse Wellington bureaucrats will drown the nation with their shockingly inefficient overhead allocation, their one-size-fits-all philosophy, and a culture which lacks accountability to everyday Kiwis and is focused instead on kind of loyalty to the super bureaucrats and the need to appease political masters in Wellington. So I think, collectively, councils have got to get their acts together and collaborate. And in many cases, they're likely to merge of their own accord. But historically, we've seen complacency in councils, and they haven't exhibited that kind of recognition of the urgency to change. And I mean, this is one of the problems we've seen with unregulated monopolies in the past. They'll fight change at every and councils have to realise that their only hope of survival is to evolve faster than the reform steamroller, to work with tangata whenua, to work together and actually focus on what they can do really well and show that they can outperform central government and therefore fight for a greater share of our taxation revenue. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. And thanks for not holding back and sugarcoating any of that. That was really well done. So quickly moving on to Mayor Paula Southgate from Hamilton City Council. Thank you, Paula.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity, because I believe this is one of the most critical discussions that we need to have for local government New Zealand at this time. And that is the eye-watering costs of future infrastructure, of which Three Borders is just one part. I think, starting with the premise that we all accept that the current model is not fit for purpose, it's far from optimal having 67 entities running critical water infrastructure all in different ways. The Minister yesterday talked about underinvestment and the increasing government standards, and that's the lie of the land. Me personally and my council, we accept that the economic case for some nature of change has been made. I mean, that's been peer reviewed. But we've rejected the current model for a number of reasons that some of my colleagues here today have already touched on. We are a fast-growing council, one of the fastest in the country, and we feel that the current model would create a disconnect between the growth planning and strategic planning that we've undertaken and the delivery of water services. So looking forward in terms of what would be optimal, I'm going to go back and forward a bit in this talk. We need to get a better alignment with our strategic framework and our planning. I know we have spent a long time working on Future Proof, which is a sub-regional group. We've worked with Hamilton to Auckland, H2A. We've worked across the Golden Triangle to look at strategic arrangements. So those need to be given proper consideration to. We do support understanding more and working with iwi to enable them to be kaitiaki of the water resources that we share. No one owns water. There will be no privatisation, or nor should there be, but everybody is a caretaker of this resource. Following on from what Anne said, I think part of the future must require clearer, faster and deeper conversation than we've had so far. The campaign of misinformation is immense. And that's just because people don't understand enough. And of course, we're going through COVID hard times, so they're dealing with enough as it is. What I'd really like to see in the future is more expert and industry voices in the room. So here we are in an infrastructure conference, and we need to hear from infrastructure specialists. We need to hear from other planning and specialists and economists and all of that to weave it together for the right solution. I believe that local government needs to stay in the game. This is not the current reform proposal, is not the end result we need. We need to work with local government. So I reject the idea of tossing out local government because they didn't please everyone. We've got to work with local government. We've got to work with central government to reshape the reform in a way that suits local places better. And getting on to the next bit, what's really critical to me in the future is that local government is about place making and local voice. And this is why I think we're best placed to inform the priorities of our local communities. We can also deliver on the government's priorities. So there needs to be a joined up conversation. How do we help you deliver on housing? How do we build a strong economy? And how do we deliver water standards? We are debt constrained. And so I think we need to look at that and consider how would reform be better for local communities? How would it be better for ratepayers, and how would it be better for New Zealand Inc.? In the introduction, we heard about debt constraint, and that's absolutely true. We're in that situation of debt constraint. What more could be achieved if we were able to move some of this debt from our books and either use it to borrow against other critical infrastructure, such as housing, or to relieve some of the financial pressure on ratepayers? Those are critical conversations. Yeah, so I think those are the main points from my perspective. Councils want to retain some financial control, and there are actually models around the globe in which that does happen. And that's been one of the primary concerns for Hamilton City Council, the treatment of the assets. How do we, as Anne has said, how do we retain some control over the assets that ratepayers have funded over the years, but how do we get the best return for the ratepayers? That's critical. And that's not just economic return, that's the social, environmental and cultural well-being return of the free waters. So I don't think we're there yet whatsoever, but look, I'm pleased to be here because I lay down the challenge. We really need to hear from other sectors in the community. At the moment, those of us who put ourselves out to talk about reform are experiencing incredible backlash. But there's no depth to the understanding of the wider community. The things I heard yesterday from all the speakers on this conference were fantastic, but they're not getting translated down to local communities. And that's the first step we've got to do, is we've got to build layers of understanding, and we've got to bring stronger collaboration with other councils, with local government, with other partners outside of local government, and with central government.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. Very interesting, your comments around looking at bringing wider groups of expertise into these reforms as we move forward. So thank you for that wonderful comment. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions. I've certainly got some. We're now going to move to Dr. Roger Blakeley, Councillor for the Greater Wellington Regional Council and a fellow traveller through the amalgamation of Auckland, where some of us had the question, if amalgamation is the answer, please tell us what the question was. So over to you, Roger.
Kia ora mai tātou. Thank you, David. And taking the first question about what do I believe would be the optimal arrangements for water reform. Well, as a councillor of Greater Wellington Regional Council, I support the need for government's water services reforms, and so also does our council. That said, I think there are significant improvements that can be made to the governance model. Firstly, why do I support the reforms? Well, I accept the government's analysis that the publicly owned new water services entities with the scale proposed and the separate balance sheets provide the best opportunity to raise the finance required of $185 billion over the next 30 years and implement the improvements required in Three Waters infrastructure. Second, how could government's proposal be improved? Well, Greater Wellington has recommended to the government 3 significant changes to the governance model and to council and iwi mana whenua representation. So our first recommended change is to adjust the model by taking an approach more akin to extending the Wellington Water model with assets transferred. Wellington Water provides Three Waters network management services to its 4 council clients, also its shareholders. A representative from each council shareholder sits on the Wellington Water Committee, which provides overall leadership and direction to a company through a statement of intent and appointment of a board of independent directors. The second change is to establish subgroups within the entities. For example, Entity C could have subgroups of C1, say from Hawke's Bay to East Coast, C2 from Greater Wellington to Horowhenua, and the C3 for the top of the South Island. The third change would be expanding the membership of the regional representative groups to include all councils in each subgroup. For Entity C, that would be 22 rather than 6 councils currently, and all iwi mana whenua. These changes would, we think, establish a direct line of accountability from each council and each iwi on the regional representative group, while still retaining the structure of a board of independent directors to provide governance to the entity, and it could retain the same operational scale of the 4 entities. We think this change could resolve the major concerns that many councils and iwi have about ensuring lines, lines of accountability back to councils, iwi and communities. We've asked the newly appointed joint working group to explore this option. Excuse me, taking the second question, if 3 waters are removed as a key function of local government, what does this mean for the future of local government? Well, removal of 3 waters as a key function of local government could spark a fundamental rethink of the roles of central and local government in New Zealand, building on the current Future of Local Government panel review. It's worth saying that currently in this country, 88% of public expenditure is at central government level and only 12% at local government level. And that makes us amongst the most centralised economies in the developed world. In other countries similar to New Zealand, local government is responsible for almost half of public spending. So are we headed for the demise of local government? I don't think so, not necessarily at all. Applying foresight, I would like to present you with a very brief scenario of what could happen. So come with me, and we are now in 2050 looking back. In 2023, the Future of Local Government report recommended stronger governance for citizens, where local government has taken a stronger leadership role in meeting the needs of local communities. It represents communities' issues, identifies these, advocates for resources, and brokers solutions. It embraces the concept of localism that Susan Freeman-Green talked about this morning. In 2026, a Royal Commission inquiry into public governance structures in New Zealand undertook a systematic review of the functions of central and local government at the local level. Local government from then on played a larger role in areas such as public health, coordination and integration of social services, urban development, employment, services to young people not in employment, educational training, design of vocational training, and provision for social and affordable housing. Well, by 2050, there has been a progressive rebalancing between central and local government responsibilities at the local level. Spending by local government is now almost half public spending. There is now better alignment on policy and funding between central and local government. There have been demonstrable benefits, more responsiveness of public services at the local level to citizens and communities, improvements in productivity and innovation. New Zealand has achieved a stable state economy with economic growth within environmental limits and higher living standards for all New Zealanders. In the most recent local government elections, voter turnout was 90%. Thank you.
I love the vision of the future, Roger, and I think your sum up has been quite good to lead us into a question that's been burning in my mind, given some of the deep thought that we went through in Auckland, looking at amalgamation of Auckland prior to that, and really significant questions around things like, were we going to end up with a democratic deficit? Was there going to be an opportunity for localism to disappear through the changes? Separating things like services from democracy, so that we get to a situation where various parts of local government are delivered in the most efficient and effective way with the right expertise and the right governance, as opposed to acceding to and hearing and engaging with the public around democratic services and so on, so that we ended up with a large number of CCOs, which for all have been, let's just say, somewhat controversial along the way. But overall, I would grant, or I would posit that been quite positive in a lot of ways, especially where the governance has been thought through well. So my challenge to the panel now is how do we actually think about balancing these two things, the operations and services of local government, and as Roger said, these things, the functions, the actual functions of these things may be up for grabs in terms of how we redefine the role of local government and central government. So what balance do you think we should arrive at in separating out these functions that we wish delivered, and by whom at what level, and also how do we maintain a sense of democracy through the changes? So is anyone willing to have a crack at that question? I can see Anne, hand straight up. Thank you, Anne.
Well, I mean, I'm in my position simply because that got out of balance. So Tauranga no longer has local democratic representation managing it, because that got out of balance. And I think you've got to go back to what democracy looks like in the modern world, and we've got to look forward. And there's no doubt, and every elected member will knows this, that increasingly it's harder to get responsiveness from your communities, particularly in local government. And you only need to look at the voting numbers, which are on a downward spiral. When you go out for consultation, you've really got to think about, how do we consult with our communities? Social media has changed the conversations that people are having quite considerably. And Paula touched on it. How do we get the expert voice out there, having the reasoned conversations out in the wider community that then feeds into that decision making? And I think it's a huge challenge for us all, whether we're in local government or central government. We get those constant voices from a particular demographic in our community that unbalances the decisions that councils have to make. We do need to be delivering those services in a most efficient way, but sometimes a part of the community don't agree and don't think that that's the right thing to be doing. And if you're going to be voted in every 3 years, often you listen to that part of the community.
Response to that. Let's go, Paula, you're first.
Thank you. Just one point to add to that is that we need to move away from the 3-year planning cycle to the 30-year planning cycle. So, and the 10 even. But, you know, we have a 10-year LTP, but we all know it's a rolling 3-year long-term plan. It just keeps getting radically changed every 3 years, depending on what the leadership looks like. So we've got to move away from that. And that's where I go back to leaning on the strength of strategic planning frameworks that we put in place with community buy-in and input. You start there. Once those are embedded, I mean, you're testing them as you go, but you don't need to keep rewriting the future all of the time, which seems to happen almost on an annual plan basis, and that's got to stop.
I'm just going to interrupt. We've had a couple of really interesting questions come in whilst we've been talking about the future of local government. One of them is, do you think that we need an upper house or a constitution or similar to that, which I think rolls on a bit from Roger's outlining of this. Who's doing what and at what level? So who wants to have a crack at that one? Yes, go, Roger.
I don't think an upper house is necessary for New Zealand or ideal. I do think a constitution for New Zealand is necessary and important. So at the moment, local government is simply a creature of statute and could be disestablished by any future government of the day. I think another thing about the constitution is through that we could establish a better understood relationship between local government and tangata whenua. So at the moment we are not the Crown and we do not have a treaty partner responsibilities, but through a constitution it could make it clear that local government is a partner with tangata whenua.
Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I totally agree. The constitution discussion should happen. And I think that the upper house is an interesting space. And I don't think it's been given a lot of conversation time or deep thought in a wider sense. But I do believe that if the mayors fitted into that upper house or some other local piece sat there, then all the changes and legislation that came through New Zealand would have a New Zealand lens and a local lens put over it. And at the moment, it all seems to be a national lens. So some way of bringing the local in. And just to your point before, I think having experts involved in council decision-making is so important, but so is having a range of people, backgrounds, ethnicities, ages on councils. And at the moment, we live in a place where too many in New Zealand in the past, just the setup has been, if you have got enough time on your hands and enough money in the bank, you can stand for council. And we need we need those people as well, but we need a different range of people with younger experience in the prime of their life, willing to give up their 30s, 40s, 50s, to deliver for their communities. And councillor wages at the moment don't encourage enough people to stand.
Neil, I think you may have the final word. Over to you.
Oh, well, I wouldn't want to offend anyone. I think one of the key things is a competency requirement to stand either at local or central government, and then a compulsory training regime to lift the capability of the people that are actually making the decisions. I think that's one of the things that puts our sector at risk.
Right. Okay. So I see our time has been somewhat extended. I'm waiting for Rory to interrupt us, but in the meantime, we'll try and wrap up a little. The word that comes to mind in terms of the future of local government for me is a word borrowed from Europe called subsidiarity, which essentially says who's doing what at what level and why. And I think Roger's comment that maybe the rethink around the roles of central and local government may be up for grabs. As one professor said to me one day, it's quite obvious that in most circumstances when we're looking at long-term or fundamental reform, that the looking glass is looking down and not necessarily being reflected back up. So as Susan Freeman-Green said this morning, we really do need to think about a system of government which involves both central and local government. So I'm going to wrap up and let Rory come back in shortly. I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of the panel. And seeing as how Rory is not knocking down the door, do any of you want to have a final word? As politicians, of course.
Well, everybody wants a final word. If I was going to say one word, it goes back to the fundamental for local government placemaking.
Yep, nice.
Okay. We're ready.
Okay, Rory, are you coming back in, are you? There you are.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you. I guess just to wrap up what was a really interesting and just a fantastic session. I heard lots of different things in there, particularly around placemaking, the hugely important role of local government in our communities, the tremendous opportunity that we're currently presented with, the importance of infrastructure across our local government, the need for the apoliticisation of infrastructure and transparency and expertise in our infrastructure requests for cooperation across a whole range of agencies. And I think one of the things that came through over and over was pace and speed. And I heard that several times across all our speakers. It really just remains for me to thank all of our speakers. Thank you, David Norman, for kind of kicking us off and setting the scene. Dr. David Wilson, thank you very much for chairing the session so well. Honourable Commissioner Anne Tolley, thank you. Mayor Sam Broughton, Mayor Neil Holdom, Mayor Paula Southgate, and Councillor Dr. Roger Blakeley. Thank you all very much for openly and honestly expressing your opinions this morning. I'd also like to thank GHD, who are our session sponsor. Again, thank you very much for that. Without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do these things half as well as we do. And all that remains for me to do is direct everyone to our next session, which is lessons on Scottish Water's reform. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.